I remember the heat before anything else. It pressed down on the valley like a lid, sealing us inside a furnace of dust and thirst. We had marched since nightfall, armor scraping skin raw, tongues swollen, eyes burning. By dawn, we stood above the wells, empty leather flasks hanging at our hips, and saw the enemy banners rising across the hills. They were everywhere, lines upon lines, ranks folding outward until the horizon itself seemed armed. Drums rolled in the distance, slow and patient, as if time belonged to them alone. We counted without speaking, thousands, then more. Against them we were scraps of steel and faith, a remnant dragged south by pride and oaths we could no longer remember clearly. Our horses trembled. Some collapsed outright, legs buckling, foam crusting their mouths. Men knelt beside them and prayed, not for victory, but for shade. The sun climbed higher, bleaching color from the world. Sweat turned to salt on our faces. Every breath felt stolen. We knew the road behind us was gone. Fires burned where we had marched, smoke drifting lazily, a reminder that retreat meant death by thirst or arrow. Scouts returned with hollow eyes and shaking hands. There was no water left. The wells were held. The hills were held. The air itself felt held, waiting for us to break. I heard armor creak as men shifted their weight, conserving strength like coin. Some whispered psalms, others stared forward, mouths open, already defeated in their minds. No one spoke of escape. Numbers made such talk obscene. We were surrounded by certainty. The enemy did not rush us. They let the day work. Arrows fell in slow, measured storms, not to kill, but to remind us how exposed we were. Shields grew heavy, arms numbed. Wounded men cried for water we did not have, their voices cracking into animal sounds that haunted the line. I felt the certainty settle then, heavy as my helm. This was not a battle to be won. It was a closing of hands. We were being pressed into a smaller and smaller space until nothing remained. History would not remember our reasons, only the mathematics of our end. When the wind shifted, it carried the smell of smoke and horses and men who would soon be dead. I knew, with a calm that frightened me, that none of us were meant to leave that valley alive. The ground burned through our boots. Time slowed until seconds felt carved from stone. I tasted blood from split lips and iron from fear. Somewhere a standard fell, and no one moved to lift it. The sky offered no mercy, only light without shadow. In that suspended hour, before steel met flesh, I understood the truth we shared. Courage would not save us. Prayers would not save us. Memory would not save us. Only death was certain, and it was already walking toward us. The silence tightened, counting heartbeats, as the first horns finally sounded at dawn. The king rode along the line after sunrise, though calling it a ride was generous. His horse moved at a slow, careful walk, ribs visible beneath the hide, hooves striking sparks from stone. He sat rigid in the saddle, not from pride, but because pain had locked his body into that posture long ago. His face was pale beneath the helm, lips cracked, eyes ringed with dark shadows that never left him now. We all knew his condition. Everyone did. The sickness clung to him like a second armor, eating him quietly, day by day. Bandages wrapped his hands and neck, soaked through despite constant changing. Some men could not look at him without flinching. Others looked harder, as if daring fate to finish what it had begun. This was the man meant to lead us out of the valley. He should not have been there. A king so young should not already walk with death beside him. He should not have been mounted, breathing dust, skin burning beneath steel. He should have been in a shaded chamber, ruling through words and seals, not standing at the edge of annihilation with a dying army. Yet he came anyway. As he passed, men straightened without thinking, shields lifted, spines locked, not because they believed he could save us, but because something in his presence refused surrender. He did not speak at first. He only looked at us, really looked, one face at a time, as if fixing us into memory before it was too late. I was close enough to hear his breathing. It rasped, uneven, controlled by discipline rather than strength. His hands trembled slightly on the reins. Blood seeped through the wrappings again, dark against white cloth. He noticed none of it, or pretended not to. Finally, he stopped. He did not promise victory. He did not speak of miracles. His voice was quiet, cracked by thirst and sickness, but it carried. He spoke of ground that could not be yielded, of vows spoken years before that had led us here. He named the enemy without hatred, only clarity. He told us plainly that retreat meant death, and standing still meant the same. There was no deception in him. That was what unsettled us most. He admitted his weakness openly. He spoke of his failing body, of nights spent unable to sleep from pain, of how each day felt borrowed. A king confessing such things before soldiers should have broken authority. Instead, it anchored it. If even he stood here knowing his end was near, what excuse remained for the rest of us? When he finished, silence followed. No cheers, no raised swords, only nods. Men tightening straps, adjusting grips, preparing themselves for the moment that would erase them. As he moved on, I realized something with cold clarity. This king was not leading us toward survival. He was leading us toward meaning, toward a death that would not be silent or forgotten. He was already half a ghost, riding among men who would soon join him, and in that valley of certainty, that was enough to make us follow. By midday, the sun had stripped away illusion. Shadows shrank to knives beneath our boots, and the air itself seemed to grind against the lungs. Arrows had ceased. The enemy waited, certain that thirst would finish what steel would not. We stood in ranks that felt thinner with every breath, listening to our own hearts. Messengers moved along the line, repeating the same order: hold, not advance, not retreat, hold. It was an order that felt like mockery, yet it bought us time to understand what was being asked. Holding meant dying slowly. Holding meant watching the wounded sink into dust while the enemy conserved strength. The king called his captains together near a low rise of scorched earth. I stood close enough to hear fragments carried by the wind. Voices were low, urgent, restrained by discipline. Numbers were spoken again, as if repetition might change them. Water was mentioned once, then never again. At last the king spoke, and the captains fell silent. He did not look at the hills. He looked at the men. He spoke of movement, not escape, of striking before the day finished us, of a charge that would tear a wound through the enemy line or tear us apart attempting it. He did not dress it as strategy. He named it for what it was: refusal. Refusal to kneel under heat, refusal to wait for thirst, refusal to vanish quietly. When the captains returned, the order spread without flourish. Mount, form, prepare to advance. No cries followed. Men checked straps with hands that shook despite themselves. Some kissed rings or icons. Others stared ahead, jaw clenched, already gone somewhere distant and private. I mounted with effort, legs stiff, mouth dry as sand. My horse trembled beneath me, but it did not refuse. That small obedience felt like a gift. Lines tightened, banners were lowered to be visible through dust, lances angled downward, not yet leveled, as if the army itself hesitated at the edge of the thought. The king took position at the front, a thin figure against a wall of men who knew they were already dead. He raised his hand once. The signal was simple. No speech followed. There was nothing left to explain. Time stretched. The space between heartbeats widened. I felt the weight of every decision that had led us here, pressing from the past into the present. Somewhere a man began to sob quietly, the sound swallowed by wind. Then the hand fell. We stepped forward as one, boots striking dust in a sound like rain on stone. Not running, not charging, advancing, the most terrible word I knew. With that first step, the valley seemed to inhale sharply, and I understood that whatever happened next would not be undone. Ahead, banners lifted, drums answered, and the earth began to answer our march. Each footfall an oath spoken without voice, binding us together as the distance closed and the waiting enemy finally stirred in heat and dust and light. The first arrows came low, skimming the dust like insects. Shields rose by instinct, wood and iron shuddering as shafts struck and stuck. Horses screamed. One went down beside me, legs folding as if cut from beneath it. Rider pitched forward and trampled before he could cry out. The ground ahead rippled with movement as the enemy advanced to meet us. Lines tightening, steel flashing in the sun. Then the distance collapsed. The moment of impact was not a single sound, but a tearing. Metal on metal, bone on wood. Breath ripped from lungs. My lance struck something solid and vanished from my hands. I was thrown sideways, caught myself, and drew my sword into a press so tight that there was no room to swing. Faces appeared inches away, mouths open, eyes wide with effort and fear. Blades scraped helms, shields slammed ribs. The world narrowed to weight and heat, and the certainty that if I fell, I would not rise again. Dust turned the air opaque. I fought by sound and touch, by the tug of my arm as steel met flesh. A man lunged at me, and I drove my sword into his throat, felt the resistance give, felt warm wetness spill over my hand. He fell against me, heavy and boneless, and I shoved him away without looking down. There was no time to count anything. Horses forced their way through gaps, crushing men beneath iron-shod hooves. Screams were cut short, orders were shouted and lost. I saw a banner tilt, then vanish in a surge of bodies. Somewhere to my left a line buckled. Somewhere to my right men surged forward, shouting hoarsely, not in triumph, but in defiance, as if volume alone could push the enemy back. The king was there, impossibly close, his standard moving through the chaos like a wound that refused to close. I saw him strike once, twice, movements precise and economical, as if conserving the strength he did not have. Blood smeared his wrappings again. He did not slow. He could not. Time fractured. There was only now and now and now. A blow glanced off my helm and rang my skull like a bell. I stumbled, caught myself on a shield, and nearly went down under a rush of bodies. Hands grabbed. I hacked blindly, felt resistance, felt it stop. I tasted blood again and did not know if it was mine. The enemy pressed hard, confident, furious that we still stood. Their numbers surrounded us, flowed around us, sought to close behind. And yet, in that terrible closeness, something shifted. They expected collapse. They expected us to fold inward and die quietly. Instead, we pushed. Inch by inch, step by step, we refused to give ground. Steel screamed, men died, the sun burned overhead, indifferent. And in that grinding, suffocating collision, as the lines chewed themselves to pieces, I felt the impossible begin. Not hope, not yet, but disbelief, spreading like a crack through stone. It did not happen all at once. There was no single shout, no clear moment where victory announced itself. The change came quietly, like a flaw spreading through iron under strain. I felt it first in the way the enemy hesitated, not retreating, not advancing, but pausing, as if listening for an order that did not come. Their pressure slackened, only slightly, enough to notice. Men who should have pressed forward began to look sideways. I saw it in their eyes when our blades met. Surprise edged with something colder. They had expected us to break by now, expected screams and flight. Instead, they found men who no longer feared death, because it had already been accepted. There is nothing more dangerous than an army with nothing left to lose. A gap opened where a gap should not have existed. Someone surged into it, then another. The line bent inward, then snapped back too slowly. I heard shouts behind enemy ranks, angry, urgent, but the words were lost in dust and steel. Orders could not travel fast enough through bodies packed too tightly together. We pressed, not in a charge, not in triumph, but in grim, relentless steps. Push, strike, hold, again. The rhythm took over, dulling pain, turning thought into motion. My arms burned, my grip slipped. I kept moving because stopping meant falling. Panic spreads faster than courage. One man turned, just one. I saw him try to pull away from the crush, eyes wide, breath ragged. Another followed, then another. The movement rippled outward, subtle at first, like water disturbed by a stone. The enemy ranks tightened in some places, loosened in others. Formation frayed. Their strength became a liability. Too many bodies, too little space. Those in the rear could not see what was happening at the front. Those at the front felt something was wrong but did not know why. Fear filled the gaps where certainty had been. I heard it then, not cheering, not yet, but shouting with purpose. Our men had sensed it too. The pressure was shifting. We leaned into it, driving shields forward, striking at faces rather than armor, at legs rather than chests. Men stumbled. When one fell, he did not rise. There was no room, somewhere ahead. The king's standard pushed deeper than it had any right to. I glimpsed it through dust and bodies, still moving, still advancing. That sight did something to us. It did something to them as well. A sick king should not be here. A dying army should not be advancing. The enemy began to give ground. A step, then another. Not a rout, nothing so clean, but a withdrawal born of confusion rather than command. We followed without mercy, because mercy required time we did not have. Every breath still burned, every wound still bled. This was not salvation. It was momentum, fragile and violent. As the line bent and twisted, disbelief spread through both armies. I felt it settle in my chest like a weight. This should not be happening. Numbers no longer mattered. Heat no longer mattered. Only movement did. Forward. Always forward. Because stopping now would remind us how impossible this was, and impossibility had already been left behind in the dust. The enemy line did not shatter with a sound. It unraveled. Threads pulled loose, then tore away in handfuls. What had been pressure became absence. What had been resistance became space. Space was deadly. Space meant speed. Men ran. At first it was only a few, slipping sideways, trying to find room to breathe. Then the run became visible, undeniable. Banners dipped and vanished into dust. Officers shouted themselves hoarse, striking with the flats of blades, dragging men back by collars. It did not matter. Fear had found its root, and once it does, nothing closes it. We pursued because pursuit was the only thing keeping us alive. Stopping would mean collapse. The body understands this before the mind does. I drove forward, lungs on fire, legs numb, striking at backs, at exposed necks, at anything moving away from me. The press loosened, then broke into knots of violence scattered across the field. The ground was slick now. Blood darkened the dust into mud that clung to boots and hooves. Men slipped and fell, crushed under the weight of those behind them. Horses bolted riderless, eyes rolling white. Cries rose, commands, prayers, pleas, layered into a single continuous sound that seemed to stretch across the valley. I lost sight of the king. The standard disappeared into smoke and motion, and for a moment, a cold fear gripped me tighter than any enemy hand. Then the fear passed. It no longer mattered where he was. The army was moving as if driven by one will, a force released too late to be stopped. Enemy camps burned where they stood. Tents collapsed under fleeing bodies. Supplies were trampled into the dirt. Water skins burst under hooves, spilling their contents uselessly into the ground we had been dying on hours before. I saw men drop to their knees beside puddles of blood and water mixed together, lapping like animals until they were cut down. There was no order to it. Victory never has order. It is chaos wearing a different face. I struck until my arm felt detached from my body, until the sword in my hand no longer felt like a tool, but like an extension of the will that refused to stop. When I could not strike, I shoved. When I could not shove, I advanced. Around me, men did the same, faces unrecognizable beneath grime and gore. The enemy broke fully then, streaming away toward the hills that had once promised them control. Now those hills watched in silence as the field emptied of anything that could still stand. The drums were gone. The banners were gone. Only dust and screams remained. I stood at last because there was no one left immediately in front of me. The sudden stillness was unbearable. My ears rang. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my sword. I looked down and saw blood up to my elbows and could not say whose it was. Around me, survivors stared at one another with the same hollow expression. We had crossed something irreversible. The impossible had happened, and it had happened through us. That knowledge settled heavy and strange, offering no joy, only a stunned, terrible awareness that history had turned, and none of us would ever be the same again. When the killing finally loosened its grip, it did not leave us cleanly. It lingered, clinging to breath and thought. The field lay open and ruined, a wide scar carved into the earth. Bodies were everywhere, twisted, stacked, half buried in churned dust that still drifted in the heat. The sun had begun its slow descent, but it offered no relief. It only revealed more. Men wandered without direction, moving as if drunk. Some searched for comrades, lifting helms to peer at faces that no longer answered. Others sat where they stood, staring at hands they did not recognize. A few laughed quietly, the sound thin and wrong, like something breaking inside them. I dismounted because my legs could no longer trust the saddle. When my boots touched the ground, they slid. I caught myself on a broken spear and stood there breathing, counting each inhale as if afraid the next would not come. My mouth was still dry, but thirst had become distant, unimportant, a problem belonging to another life. Wounded men cried out, then fell silent when no answer came. There were too many to help, too many to bury. Some begged to be finished, others begged for water. We gave what we could, which was almost nothing. Mercy is a fragile thing after such violence, easily crushed under exhaustion and fear. I found a friend near the edge of the field, sitting against a fallen horse. He looked at me and did not speak. When I touched his shoulder, he fell sideways, already gone. I sat there longer than I should have, because standing felt like betrayal. Smoke rose from scattered fires, smearing the sky into dull reds and browns. The enemy had fled, but their presence remained in every discarded weapon, every torn banner, every body left where it fell. Victory does not erase the dead. It only rearranges them. Word spread slowly that the king lived. The rumor moved from mouth to mouth, fragile and disbelieved at first, then steadier. He had been seen standing. He had been seen giving orders. He had been seen, bloodied but upright, refusing shade. That knowledge anchored us. Without it, I think many would have simply lain down and let the night take them. As darkness crept in, we gathered what remained of ourselves. Fires were lit. Watches were set, more from habit than necessity. The valley was quiet now, unnaturally so, as if the earth itself were exhausted. I lay on the ground and stared upward, watching the first stars appear through smoke. My body shook without permission. When I closed my eyes, I saw faces rushing toward me, mouths open, hands reaching. I opened them again quickly. This was the price. Not death, which had been promised and accepted, but survival, carrying the weight of what we had done into a future that would never feel earned. The battle was over, but it had not ended. It had only moved inside us, where it would remain, grinding, long after the field had cooled and history began to write its version of the day we refused to die. Morning came without ceremony. No horns, no banners lifted to greet it. Light crept across the valley and exposed what night had softened. The field looked smaller now, tighter, as if ashamed of what it held. Bodies lay where exhaustion had finally claimed them, armor dull, skin gray, faces fixed in expressions that no longer asked anything of the world. We moved among them carefully, stepping around the dead as if they might still feel the insult. The work began because it had to. Weapons were gathered. The wounded were sorted. Those who might live, those who would not. There were no words for the choices made. A nod, a look, a blade placed gently where a hand could not stop shaking. Water was found at last. The wells were ours, and the irony tasted bitter. Men drank and vomited, drank again, then sat weeping with relief they did not understand. Some collapsed beside the buckets, overwhelmed by the simple fact of survival. Others drank sparingly, as if afraid abundance might vanish if trusted too quickly. The enemy dead were many, more than many. Their losses lay scattered across the valley and into the hills, a trail marking their flight. We did not pursue. No one gave the order, and no one needed to. Pursuit belonged to armies with strength to spare. We had spent ours entirely. As the sun climbed, the weight of what had happened began to settle into shape. This battle would be named. It would be counted. Chroniclers would reduce it to numbers and movements, to arrows and charges and kings. They would call it a turning point. They would call it decisive. They would not speak of the man who sat beside a dying friend and whispered apologies he had no right to make. They would not speak of the soldier who refused water because the taste reminded him of blood. They would not speak of the way hands shook when there was finally nothing left to strike. The king was brought into view late in the morning. He dismounted with help, swaying, his face drawn tight with pain. When men saw him, they straightened instinctively, though many could barely stand. He acknowledged us with a single nod. He did not smile. There was no triumph in him, only endurance. He spoke briefly. He named the victory, not as glory, but as burden. He reminded us that what had been done could not be undone, only carried. Then he was led away, his strength spent, his body already demanding its price. We remained. By afternoon, the valley had changed again. Smoke thinned, sounds softened. The dead began to look like objects rather than people, a necessary distance the mind creates to continue breathing. I hated myself for feeling it, and hated myself more for needing it. I understood then that this battle would follow us longer than any enemy. It would surface in quiet moments, in the pause before sleep, in the way we watched shadows move. We had refused to die when death was certain, and the world had answered by letting us live with the consequences. History would say we won. It would be correct. It would also be incomplete. By the third day, the valley was silent, not the silence of peace, but of completion. The kind that comes after everything that can scream has already done so. Carrion birds circled without fear. The wind moved freely now, no longer blocked by ranks of men, carrying the smell of rot and ash across ground that had been fought over with prayers and steel. We left without ceremony. There was no final look back, no last count of the dead. Nothing remained to be gained by standing there longer. The earth had taken what it would take. We marched away thinner, slower, altered in ways that could not be repaired. Armor hung loose on shoulders that had shrunk under exhaustion. Horses limped. Men leaned on one another without shame. I walked near the rear and watched the valley recede. From a distance, it looked almost empty, the shapes of bodies blurred into the ground, already becoming part of it. In time, grass would grow. In time, travelers would pass without knowing exactly where they stepped. That is how it always ends. I realized then that survival had not elevated us. It had stripped us. The certainty we carried into the valley, that we would die, had been clean, almost merciful. What replaced it was heavier: memory, responsibility, the knowledge that the impossible had bent once and would never do so again in quite the same way. Someone asked me later what it felt like when the enemy broke. I did not answer. There are no words that survive such moments intact. Language fractures under that weight, leaving only fragments that mislead more than they reveal. The king did not ride at the front when we left. He was carried, wrapped in cloth darkened by blood and dust, eyes closed, jaw clenched against pain that had finally demanded its due. Men removed their helms as we passed him, not in celebration, in acknowledgement. He would be remembered. Of that, I had no doubt. His name would be spoken alongside the word victory. Songs would shape him into something cleaner, stronger, more complete than the man I had seen bleeding into bandages beneath an unforgiving sun. The rest of us would dissolve into numbers, survivors, casualties, footnotes. That night, as we made camp far from the valley, I woke suddenly, certain I had heard horns. My hand closed around a sword that was no longer there. It took time to remember where I was, and longer to accept that no one was coming. I lay awake until dawn, staring at a sky that looked no different than it had before the battle. That was the cruelest part. The world had not noticed what we had done. It continued, indifferent and unchanged. When morning came, we marched again, and with every step, I understood the final truth of that day. We had not escaped death at all. We had only delayed it, carrying its shadow forward with us, etched into bone and breath, until the moment history would no longer need our refusal, and would collect what it had patiently been owed since the valley first closed its hands around us.